Hello everyone. Welcome back to the Life of Waste podcast series, and we are back with the second season of the episode podcast series. And this time we're going to start off with discussing about findings of our other project that we have mentioned to you once in a while in our first podcast series, the Spirit Project. And from this season onwards, we'll be talking about the Spirit Project, how we conceived it, and what our key findings. It's been quite the while now since we began the project. So we thought that since we have enough data, enough findings, we would bring to you this information in a podcast format as we did last time. So today, as we are going to discuss about the podcast series of the Spirit Project and how we conceived it, we have our principal investigator, Professor René Véron, with us again. So, hi René, how are you?
Hi, Malith. Hello.
So, René, as you know, has been part of our podcast series now. I think this is the third time that we are doing a podcast episode together. So, René, I would say that is our principal investigator, and we have been working together in waste since 2019, 2018 now for a very long time. So, René is the principal investigator I told you about the Spirit Project. So, René, shall we start by maybe briefly introducing to our viewers why did you, in the first place, actually thought of submitting a proposal titled Spirit? As in, it's not the I know the grant is called Spirit, but the name is different. So, why did you want to submit a proposal?
Yeah, it was different factors. Like with every research project, we were not quite finished doing our work with
Mhm,
the R4D project, and we were interested in continuing that research that we started there.
mhm,
At the same time, we also wanted to work together with the same people. Many of us had at that time started to work on waste maybe only 4 years
mhm,
ago. And we were just sort of feeling that we start to understand the social and political dimensions of waste better and better.
yeah.
And then the project came to an end. So that was definitely a reason. But maybe more importantly, we also found an opportunity since with the R4D, we already had this focus on crisis and a sort of a general question on, how crisis can sort of influence policy change, transformations, and so on and so forth. And we had a different crisis in three different countries. In Sri Lanka, it was the landfill slide.
Mhm,
In India, which was of course part of the R4D, but unfortunately not fully part of the spirit.
mhm,
It was garbage strikes in,
yeah.
in, in Kerala. And in Nepal, it was, of course, the disruptions due to the earthquake and
Mhm,
the ensuing also blockade of India that made it difficult to bring in fuel to Kathmandu in particularly. Yeah, so we had three different crises, and then it's kind of each crisis has its own kind of particularity. So it was also kind of difficult to generalize from there. They also happen at different times, so it was quite tricky. And then, uh, luckily for us,
mhm,
unluckily for us as researcher, unluckily for the world population, COVID
mhm,
came along
exactly.
as a kind of huge crisis, as a global crisis that, of course, affected all three countries that I just mentioned.
Mhm,
Of course, also not with exactly the same temporality, and of course, the measures against COVID were not the same in the three countries, but nevertheless, it was of a one crisis point that was easier then to prepare. And we were just interested then to follow up a little bit more on our general question of how crisis influences transformation in the waste sector and beyond.
mhm. So I think, Renee, it's really interesting to see how these opportunities spring up from one project to another, to not just to expand from the previous findings, but also how, as you said, lucky for researchers, but unlucky for the people in the world, how COVID became an interest especially in terms of how the COVID-19 um, affected everyday aspects of human life. So I was wondering, René, so if we can specify maybe to our viewers how, what sort of things that you're looking at this in this project, as in to be very specific, the objectives or the aims of the project are, as into, was it to simply continue the findings that you have gathered from the previous R4D project, or if not, to sort of look at the overall cascading effects of all these cascading disasters?
Yeah, it was certainly to some extent a continuation, but there were also sort of kind of new elements that we picked up with the new project. One was a much stronger focus to waste workers, and the other one was a stronger focus on gender relations and how that interconnects with waste. So these were sort of really highlighted. That is very clearly.
Mhm,
Then I would also say that to some extent it is a continuation. So we started realizing that the kind of assertion that a crisis represents an opportunity has to be a bit nuanced, and also sort of we have also sort of moved beyond looking, as you sort of mentioned, only at one crisis, a crisis point, and thinking, well, there's a before, then there's a crisis, and then there's an
mhm,
after.
mhm,
Okay, with a little bit of a during the crisis,
mhm,
and have sort of realized more the idea of the cascading crisis, as you mentioned it, where one crisis is kind of linked to another crisis, cascading into others temporarily or sectorally. And so we have sort of kind of nuanced our conceptualization of crisis. It's no longer just a crisis moment, let's say COVID, but it's more like a processes of crisis that we are looking at the moment. And we are much less into, let's say, cause effect
mhm.
relationships now than we were maybe when we sort of conceived of this project.
Yeah. And another question, Renee, that actually came up to my mind when you discussed about these cascading effects and how we have moved on from one disaster to many disasters, and maybe also, previous disasters having influence on the current way that we actually manage disasters in general. Why is it so important to study crisis, especially in relation to a subject matter such as waste management?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's one thing about waste management, but for me, well, of course, I'm interested in waste management and particularly more appropriate waste management
Hmm.
that takes into the context, but then also, um, sorry, that takes into consideration the context, the local context, but then also kind of more social
Hmm.
dimensions and so on and so forth. So that is important. But for me, waste is also an opportunity to see broader issues within a society, political changes, economic changes, and so on and so forth. So for me, the waste sometimes is also just as a means to look at something more broadly. Yes. Uh, so the crisis, it's a little bit like I sort of explained before. I think it is important because, well, there's basically different views of history, of the history of humankind, right? One view is that there's of kind of gradual progress
Hmm.
and change that comes along gradually. And another view is that change, progress is happening in busts and bursts very quickly, sometimes in periods of transition.
Hmm.
And crises are such potentially such periods of transition, even though we had to then relate, we sort of put that also a little bit in question. So it was also so from that point of view, so very general, what do crises do to humanity, to policies, to economic systems, and so on and so forth. It's particularly important also in view of today's question about sustainability and the need of having, let's say, socio-ecological transformation. So is this transformation coming very quickly because of a crisis, because we are basically pushed to change things? Or can it be more planned, a more soft landing into a new socio-ecological systems or not? So if you want, the project actually also addresses these bigger questions, but of course not in a direct way, but in a very indirect way. And then for this particular thing of COVID, the COVID crisis, waste seemed to be a particularly good entry point because waste work was considered an essential service. So it was in everybody's kind of perception, and it was clear to everyone that waste work is actually important, and we tend otherwise usually to kind of invisibilize it, as mentioned in another postcards that we had. But it comes sort of to the forefront, and so we thought, well, yeah, it's so much in the forefront during COVID, so the chances that also policies in the waste sector practices will change is quite high.
Yeah. So I think it's really, really interesting that how the project has progressed and how we have done the data collection overall in the mainly in Sri Lanka and Nepal. So, and also I think we've been trying to also complement the findings from India as well in the Spirit project. So really, of course, you don't have to go into detail, but could you briefly tell us, what we can expect in the upcoming episodes, as in what we have sort of found out about what has happened, the changes that have taken place?
Yes.
Briefly, yes.
So obviously we're still sort of analyzing all the data, but it turns out to be quite complex to know what crisis, also of a polycrisis or serious of crisis actually do. And what we have really found that probably the nature of the crisis itself has an influence on what happens. I mean, when the crisis is directly related to waste management, like the collapse of a garbage dump that
Yeah.
affects people and so on and so forth, then there seems to be a clear policy response. When it's less directly linked to waste, let's say the Indian blockade to Nepal, then it seems to be a less an incentive for policymakers to actually change things in the waste sector. So that's one thing. The nature of crisis in itself, I think, is important, and that's something that has, to my knowledge, not theorized sufficiently yet, and I think we can make there also quite a contribution. Then we also looked a little bit in theories actually of crisis, and they're mostly sort of linked to systems thinking, and they have sort of mostly evolved from a Western context. Where it is maybe more common that you have a one crisis and then the crisis is over. And so you can sort of maybe better sort of think about these cause-effect relationships. But in the case of countries of the global south, it's really sort of this idea of cascading crisis is more realistic. So I think we have already, or we start to nuance that theory a little bit. And in that theory, there's already considered that a crisis can have different outcomes. And that is quite interesting to us. So one outcome can be a transformation. I mean, a thorough change, not only in the particular sector, but perhaps more of kind of how the whole thing is organized, how the whole system is organized. And maybe when we look at our cases, the case of Kerala comes maybe closest to that. And again, it's a garbage-related crisis, the garbage strikes that have really pushed the state government, municipalities to rethink the whole system.
Mhm.
And they have rethought the system from a linear waste chain into one that is much more circular. They have moved from invisibilizing waste to visibilizing it in the sense that people have to go to collection points. They
Mhm.
see there what's happening with the waste. They see the composting. So they are much more sensibilized about the issue and therefore probably also more motivated and more skilled to segregate waste at source. So that is perhaps of the case that is the most transformative, even though there it is under threat from kind of policies at the national level that
Mhm.
promote other forms of waste management, including incineration and so on and so forth, more centralized systems. So another case is maybe a case, well, in the literature it's not called like that, but we sort of thought we might call it like the case of muddling through.
Mhm.
Okay, so there's a crisis, then you respond, cope with it more or less well, and then afterward you more or less go back to business as usual until the next crisis is. So
Mhm.
the whole sector might still not be functioning very well. Yes, but I mean the crisis has not changed dramatically the scenario. And maybe closest to that type of ideal type is maybe Nepal. Uh, yes, I mean, there is some incremental change, incremental improvements. The
Mhm.
segregation rates, for example, they increase. The involvement of the private sector has increased and relatively in a positive way. However, the whole idea of a more linear change has not really been tackled there.
Yeah.
The issues with the landfills remains. There's up here and there some strikes, some events, but the whole system seems, as of now, not totally challenged so that it would change
Mhm.
in a transformative way. So this is not to take away from, as I said, some progress that has been made, right? So yeah, that's the one case. And the final case in that literature, well, apart from a total collapse of the system, but we have not seen that.
Mhm.
But let's say the third scenario that we encounter to some extent is a scenario where crisis can intensify the problem. And here again, it's a bit difficult, but maybe Sri Lanka comes the closest to this ideal type. When we look at the response, maybe less to COVID, but particularly the collapse of the landfill, the land
Mhm.
dump,
Yeah.
we see that the first reaction of the government was to further centralize waste management, to use yet another landfill, even bigger, and so on and so forth, thinking about incineration technologies,
Mhm.
but not really addressing issues of people's responsibility also, making them also aware, giving them the tools to for example, segregate more efficiently their wastes and so on and so forth. So to some extent, I would say that has intensified the crisis because the next maybe not a landslide collapse, but something
Mhm.
similar bad can happen in the new landfill. I mean, it's already happening with pollution of water bodies and so on and so forth. So yeah, for
Exactly.
me that is a little bit a case, but again, these are ideal types, and Sri Lanka has also other tendencies and also tendencies of at least partial transformation and progress. And that I think you guys have pointed it out, you and Nishara, how interestingly households during the COVID started to pick up composting by
Mhm.
themselves, just because it was kind of difficult just to hand over wastes to the municipal workers. The system did not work anymore. Even after the COVID, now a few years after the COVID, of course, COVID has been followed by the political economic crisis. There is not enough money to have the same efficient waste
Hmm.
collection as pre-COVID.
Exactly.
So collection days have been reduced and so on and so forth. This is actually all giving some sort of an incentive to people to take a little bit more care of their own waste and through composting, which from a socio-ecological point of view is probably rather a positive
Hmm.
thing. So it's not all about intensification of a problem, but
Hmm.
there's of kind of contradictory processes going on in parallel. So yeah, sorry, I took quite a long time to
No, no, that's
discuss these
good.
results, but indeed that they're really complex. And it's really, we moved way beyond of the idea, the hypothesis crisis leads to change, right?
Hmm.
So we can really nuance this type of assertion now. And I think we have very good data to do that.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. Thank you, René. Even though you took a little bit of time, I think that was needed. To point out how and what we have actually learned. When you were discussing, it also crossed my mind. Crisis, especially the ones of nature that has taken place in Sri Lanka, the cascading ones, actually points to many things in terms of who are more vulnerable when it comes to uh, when it comes to utilizing the services offered by the local councils and how local councils themselves are struggling to maintain their workforce and how the workforce themselves, can become victims of exploitation and also heroization in some certain extensions and immediate vilification after a while. So for me personally, it sort of showed up, opened up my eyes about, how this relationship that which exists between the waste workers and also the residents and the local councils, politicians, this very complex mechanism of waste work in general operates in crisis situations. And I think that was very interesting for me to see how that takes place. And also another key finding for us from Sri Lankan side is that post-COVID, waste management largely is run by bureaucrats in an absence of politicians. And where there, how the priorities have changed over time with the larger goal of saving money because Sri Lanka is now officially have come out of bankruptcy. But as René pointed out, it's the nature of the crisis. So when it's an economic crisis, the focus is on cutting down expenses, and the local councils are now focusing more on providing services um, uh, while making certain adjustments to their financial policies. So no extensive expenses, new recruitments, and no incentives in terms of overtime work, or even maybe the earlier proposed insurance policies for waste workers. So lots of cut downs, and you realize that often groups that who are sort of menial and who provide actually the labor are the first ones to actually experience the brunt of these cuts, not the bureaucrats or the politicians. But overall, I think for me, the biggest difference would be, seeing this mechanism of change, how the mechanism itself, not just the change or not, no, not the change, but it's a mechanism of change that really pushed me to think while collecting data. So as we are talking about collecting data, this time we employed some different data collection techniques other than the ones that we usually did. For example, shadowing. The initial plan was to actually, give cameras to waste workers, but because of certain issues with the administration from the local councils and also, difficulty in sort of providing them with these cameras with the approval of the local council, they had to go for shadowing. And so that too itself has been quite interesting. But I see that the approach that we have done here compared to R4D in terms of dissemination is a little bit different. We have lots of more visual sort of dissemination now. Shall we talk about that a little bit, Renee?
Yeah, I think the Spirit program is a very different program from the R4D program. Spirit is much more academically oriented,
Mm-hmm.
and the focus is much more on publications, academic publications,
Mm-hmm.
and disseminating knowledge to academic audiences. That does not mean that key stakeholders are not informed and
Mm-hmm.
included, but that is of kind of rather secondary in the Spirit project. And so for that purpose also, we are planning to publish a book, an edited volume
Mm-hmm.
that highlights and showcases the different case studies along different dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
The dimension of, let's say, household level practices, the dimension of waste work, discourses linked to waste, and then we also hope to bring together something on policy changes post crisis or post certain crisis moments. And the R4D project was, of course, much more to include stakeholders and to show them also some kind of interesting, innovative ways of dealing with waste. And I'm not quite sure whether you had the chance to have a podcast with CED, the Center for
Mm-hmm.
Environment and Development, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where many of you were able to actually visit Kerala and
Mm-hmm.
see sort of really firsthand what they did, and not in the sense of saying that Kerala is a best practice, or in the sense that, well, look at Kerala and do the same, learn your
Mm-hmm.
lessons from there. It's
Yeah.
really more in the sense of an exchange and to say, oh, look at there, and maybe you can think about what would maybe work in your context as well. Might stimulate you to try something, to experiment things. So rather than an approach of best practices, we had clearly an approach of exchanging information, exchanging views, and so on and so forth. So something like that is not in the orbit in the pursuit of the Spirit project,
Mm-hmm.
which is really much more academic. But it has its own advantages because with the R4D project, we were not able, or we did not have the time in the end to theorize, to push that
Mm-hmm.
level a little bit further because it was just more applied, and our kind of implementation partners, they were not so much interested in theorizing
Mm-hmm.
crisis. That is not you know their daily bread and butter. They
Mm-hmm.
were interested in having some real world outcomes, not
Mm-hmm.
in 20 years, but now. So yeah, different objectives of the different programs that had, well, as a consequence, we had to really adjust our methods and particularly also the methodology of dissemination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and also, I would like to remind our viewers that, of course, our podcast series continues. So, from this episode onwards, we'll be bringing to you our findings of the Spirit Project. I think you'll find it extremely interesting, especially to see how these cascading disasters can really change how waste management takes place within the Sri Lankan and Nepali context. And also, I think it would inform you how change can be temporal and how can it can be quite, it's not just the change that really affects, it's not the crisis that really affects the change, but also where you are located in the space that you share the space with, and also even the groups that you share the space with also have lots to do with the type of services and the changes that you experience. So I think that's something that definitely you'll be able to get to know by following our podcast series. So in our upcoming podcast, we'll be introducing you to our other partners, Professor Dr. Sweta Rao, who's also a key contributor from Switzerland, will be taking part in the next episode. And of course, we have our dear colleagues, Dr. Professor Mishar Fernando and also Dr. Vishnu Preti, who will be joining with us to inform us. And this time, I think the podcast series will also we'll continue with a series of short videos as well. We'll get to try to push the information that we have out now in short video format, which is now quite the trend, and also it's quite easy to approach people in that way. So we'll be bringing you the podcast in the future. I think from this episode onwards is going to be an interval of maybe 1 week or 2 week, and then we tend to release an episode every 2 weeks or so till the end of the project. And also don't forget to check out, we have an illustrated book series this time, which we have developed through the podcast, through the shadowing episode. So I'll be putting the link of the illustrated books down below in the caption, so that you can actually experience what we also saw at the field level, especially with formal waste workers in Colombo, Sri Lanka. So René, I would like to thank you so much for taking time to join the episode, even though it's short because it's an introductory episode. I think we basically covered so much in such a short time, and we'll be looking forward to having another podcast episode with you so that we can discuss this more in detail. So René, then thank you so much for
Anytime,
joining.
it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much for you guys for joining with us and listening to us. We'll be releasing the audio form of the podcast series as well quite soon, so that you can actually listen to us on the go, not just on YouTube. So hope you have a great day, a great week ahead. Do join with us in our upcoming episodes. Thank you so much. Have a great day.